Yeah, thanks for being here, everybody. I'll let Greg start off.
Yeah, so Kyle and I both started out in the tech world. Now we have our consulting practices. Just to set everyone's expectations, we are not fans of the general 1,000-slide deck. So if you could just interrupt us during our presentation with questions or comments, we would prefer for this to be more interesting and interactive. So yeah, feel free to interrupt.
We've been through a lot of these. We know how not fun they can be sometimes, so we want to make them as enjoyable. And ideally, when we were kind of talking about what we're going to talk about, period, we really wanted to be valuable for you guys. So if at any point you're like, there's something that's more valuable that maybe we're missing, feel free to chime in, because we can't tell what it's like to be on your guys' side, but we've been there before. So these are only 2 slides. We don't have any other slides to show you. We're going to turn it off in a minute because it's not that great. But we want to focus more on the conversation more than anything. So Greg and I, we've known each other for coming up on a decade. We've both been doing operations for a long time. My background, I used to, what's his face admission, I used to be in the military. I worked at a company called Gigi as an SDR. And then I took over that team and grew the SDR team from 7 to 70 in about 2 years. So that was a not fun time. Then I moved into running business operations for the company, where we went from 15 to 50 million bucks in about 4 years or so. So that's the background that I have. I started a consulting company called Kicksaw, and another one doing some other stuff. But primarily on the operations side, I help companies really formulate ideas around how to scale their Salesforce instances for Series A, B, C, D, et cetera. So that's where my background comes from, but I'll let Greg talk some more.
Yeah, so similar kind of story. I started out at a startup, ended up leaving to start analytics and operations consulting. A little over a year ago, ended up working for one of the companies in our little portfolio, and did that, built the team, scaled, hired about 100 people in a year, owned operations and analytics, and since then I'm now kind of doing consulting again. So when we were kind of trying to figure out what we want to talk about today, the topic that we kind of settled on was a lot of the way that kind of our engagements work is we come in and everything's on fire. Everything's broken, everything's on fire, people are frustrated. And we were kind of talking about it doesn't really have to be like that, it is like that, but it doesn't really need to be like that. And so we wanted to kind of talk to you guys today about why does it get there and how to kind of prevent that. So yeah, that's what we're gonna talk about today.
Cool. Where do you want to start?
So I think to start, we should talk about kind of why that happens to begin with, right? Why is it that every company we go to, there's a bunch of stuff on fire? And I think Kyle, you had some interesting ideas. Why? What are you noticing with the companies you're working with?
Yeah, so we tend to work with companies that are maybe Series A or Series B. They're growing. They definitely have a little bit of traction, maybe a couple salespeople, but they don't have an operations person. So like Greg said, everything's on fire, and they don't have a person dedicated to fixing it, right? And so there are a couple things that I really think companies need to do to execute well. The first one is having someone own specifically Salesforce. My bias is going to be focusing on Salesforce. If you use HubSpot, I'm sorry. I'm going to focus about Salesforce, but realistically, any tools that you have in the company, of all the tools you have, I should say, Salesforce is going to be really the most critical. Every team tends to touch it, but there is rarely an owner of Salesforce, especially if you're at about Series A, maybe Series B. Whoever's running operations or sales kind of all owns it, and it's unclear who can make specific decisions about the system. That's one major bottleneck we see in companies. So if anything that we'll talk about is get that solved. Second one is that executives who are responsible for Salesforce or operations generally are typically not acting like an executive. If you're an individual contributor, you're pulling levers. As an executive, you got to be focused on the forest, but they're so often focused on the trees, trying to make tactical changes themselves. And that's a huge limit we see is executives actually acting like individual contributors. Go ahead.
Random question. I found sometimes that people are introduced new tools, they think the tool replaces the protocol, right? So we've got Salesforce now, so we don't really have to figure things out because Salesforce, so to speak,
Yeah.
Have you found that also happens where people think the tech can replace the expertise?
That concept comes up a lot where people think that if I buy a tool, it will solve my problem. That doesn't happen ever. It's like if I'm overweight, I shouldn't go buy a pair of shoes to decide to exercise. I should exercise in what I've got and then eventually buy nicer clothes. So I think that we're aligned on that.
I think also, just to add one thing to that, I think the mindset is people will think, I have a really shitty process here, so I'm going to buy this tool. So a good example is companies man, none of us really know how to forecast, so we're going to buy Clary. And that doesn't actually solve your problem if the muscle's not there. So generally, you want to buy tools to accelerate good behavior. But if you already have bad behavior with whatever process you're doing, you're just going to throw away a lot of money.
Yeah, and the third one I was going to say is that operators aren't that great. There are a lot of times people that do operations really don't know how to architect a system. They don't have a background in CS. They don't really know how to go from, yeah, we've got 100,000 in revenue to 50 million and all of the changes that are going to happen across your business. But I'd throw a fourth one in there, which is, I'm blanking on it right now, so I'll stick with the original three. So those three things happen all the time. And then maybe a fourth one would be buying tools, even though they don't understand if they need them or not. So yeah.
Yeah, so to further kind of Kyle's point in terms of why we get to this point where things are on fire, I wanted to touch more on the kind of the executive thing, the idea of executives pulling levers. Why do you think they get there? Why do you think we get to that point where you have a VP of sales and you look at their system and you're like, man, like this looks like a disaster. Like what happened to all these fields? And they're like, ooh, that was me. Like I got really frustrated on a Tuesday night and just created a bunch of fields, made everyone fill it out. Like my bad, like please help.
People laughing because it happens all the time. Imagine if you saw 1,000 Salesforce instances instead of one. It's like exactly the same thing over and over. And the biggest problem, I think, or the reason that this happens is that executives don't get to where they are because they don't work hard, right? You don't become a CEO or a VP of X because you slack off all the time. You just delegate all your work. When you're an individual contributor, you work harder than anybody, so you move up, and then you move up. And you think that the only way to do more is by doing more. But the reality is you need talented people to execute, and you delegate to those people, and you allow them to operate. You are never going to be, like, if you want to get double the work done, you can't just double the amount of work that you do. You need to, at a certain point, you're such a big lever that the team is relying on you to be able to do these things. And so as an executive, I'll hit you in a sec, executive, it's really critical to find comfort in hiring lieutenants, which Greg has a ton of experience with. He didn't mention this, but he added 100 operators to a team, operations people in a year. So think about hiring 100 operations people. Like if anyone knows how to delegate, you can't pull levers on your own when you got 100 people to keep track of that are supposed to be doing that. So Greg probably has more experience than me on that, but I'll let you chime in if you'd like to.
So I think the to further kind of the reason of like why do you get to this position, a huge reason is if you are a VP of sales who is kind of not used to delegating, you're generally at these companies where you don't have a lot of operations resources. You maybe have one person right out of school, or you don't have anyone. And if you're going to be that person where you have enough experience, you've done this long enough to where you're like, I'm going to delegate, I don't want to do this at all, you're generally not going to go to a Series A company. You're going to go to a Series C or D company where there's already an ops team built out, right? You have someone who just does enablement, which is like such a crazy concept when you're a 50-person company and trying to make your number.
Yeah. So like those in my mind are the biggest three. Let's say you've got those identified, you've got them solved. Executives are acting like executive, individual contributors are solid. You've got a clear owner of Salesforce. The question now comes to how do we take where we are and where we want to be and fix that, right? That's a big challenge for a lot of companies. And so, like Greg, how do you think about that when you take on a new implementation at customers like, they're Series B, they've got $5 million in revenue, but they want to get to 50 by the end of next year. Mm-hmm. How do you support them operationally?
Yeah, so generally, and I'm assuming this works the same with your business, you go in, there's three things that are always on fire. It's usually like something with like lead opportunities is broken, the quoting process is broken, and opportunity tracking is broken. Nobody changes stages. It goes from like qualification to close one. It happens. We all do it. But once those big fires are put out, then the process is, okay, nothing's on fire, no one's screaming, what needs to be fixed? And the way we do that is we will talk to sales leaders and try to understand, explain to us what the process should be. And then from there, what we're doing is, the way that people tell us their process is, a lead comes in, it should go be qualified by an SDR. If it's not qualified, then disqualify it. If it's qualified, then just try to set a meeting. And what we're doing, we're translating that, and as an operator, you should be translating this to, okay, so a lead gets created, probably from the website, maybe manually, hopefully not. Then it's going to get round robin. Then these statuses are going to get filled out. Hopefully when it gets converted, these automations kick in. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so here is verbally what the process should be. Here is from a systems perspective, what is actually happening. And we're trying to measure that delta. So there are sometimes we talk to companies and they're like, yeah, this is the report we use. These are the fields we use. I fill that 100% of the time, pretty impressive. And we're like, great, let's move on. Like this is not broken. But the larger that delta, the larger that gap, the more we look into, we're like, okay, like this is probably something that should be fixed. Because what you think is happening and what you want to be happening is really very different from what's happening.
I feel like I see this a lot where oftentimes executive will come to us and say, we want a problem solved, but they'll dictate how it's actually solved, right? They'll say, oh, I want a quote to cash process, and make sure you use DocuSign, and make sure you do this, and make sure you do this. Do you see that on your side as well from customers, or is that outside of what you run into?
Yeah. So what happens a lot is kind of executives will think, all right, this is not working for me. Here's what I need to have happen, and they'll talk to their friends, they'll talk to their advisors, and for a good example is around quoting. People will come to me and be like, I need an approval process. I'm like, great, we all love that. What do you want it to do? Who's actually approving? Me. Okay, so you close 200 deals a quarter, you're gonna get 200 emails the last week of the quarter. Are you okay with that? Totally fine with that. Would love to approve every deal. Yeah, it's on me. But then, last week of the quarter, reps are super pissed off because none of their deals can move to close one. So what we tend to do, and by the way, we learned this the hard way from going through engagements and being like, okay, great, you want an approval process? I'm gonna build it. Try to step back from the tactical and try to avoid how things get implemented and instead focus on the goals. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a great relationship with your sales leader or your marketing leader, if you're doing marketing ops, the type of relationship you want to have is, tell me your goal, I will find a way to implement it, and as long as I'm achieving your goal and your goal has not changed, you should be indifferent as to how that gets executed. Right? And maybe the goal changes and it's hey, not only do I want this to happen, not only do I want visibility, but another goal is it should be really easy for reps. And it's okay, well, then maybe this won't work. But the idea is focus, you want to get out of solution land with people that are not systems people. You want to just focus on goals, and the proposals and what you try to get pushed through should be something that achieves those goals.
So an example that I use, I might have told this story a bunch of times, is a concept in the military called commander's intent. So let's say I'm a commander of a platoon of guys or gals, and they're gonna go take a building. I don't say, Greg, you run to the door. Kyle, you get behind Greg. Steve, you get behind Greg, and blah, blah, blah. You have to say, guys, go take down that building. You guys know the basics of what I want done. Here are the parameters, go do it. Because if they take fires or moving to the building, you don't have to tell them, make sure you execute in this way. And so as an executive or person building an operations team, I think it's really critical to be able to communicate what your intent is, right? I don't care how quote to cash or approvals get implemented. I want to make sure that every opportunity that comes through meets the requirements. How it's actually done shouldn't matter to you. And another analogy that I've seen with reporting, we get lots of requests for reporting. I need a dashboard for my executive team, or I need a report that does X. And oftentimes people will come to us with requests saying, I want a report that tells me number of opportunities by lead source, by week, by rep, by X, by Y, by Z. And it's not really helpful. So the first thing that I try to ask is, what are you trying to accomplish, or what question do you want to answer by looking at this report? You should be able to look at it, answer a question, and move on. And so a really tactical thing with dashboards is each report should answer a single question. And if you're trying to do more than that, it's going to just create confusion. And that, I think, ties into the process you're talking about with approvals, as well as if you don't have that dialed in and really tight, you're just going to make it hard on people. So yeah.
I think also to kind of further Kyle's point around reports and dashboards, in addition to answering one question, it should be one type of question. Meaning you generally want to have, a report should either tell you whether or not something's wrong or why something's wrong. You do not want to have the same report that's hey, this will tell me something's wrong, and I can also figure out what's wrong, because there's generally way too much information.
I hadn't heard the concept before. So a report should specifically tell you what is wrong, or tell you, what was the other way of putting that?
Why something's wrong.
Why something is wrong. So an analogy would be I'm short on opportunities. That's the what is wrong. The why is wrong is because inbound leads haven't been converted in the last 6 weeks or something like that, right?
Versus a lot of people try to cram that all in one place, and it's information overload.
Yeah.
Right? And then what ends up happening is leadership in sales or leadership in marketing will come to you as an operator and say, hey, I just don't really have visibility. These reports are not helping me. And you're well, if you look at this axis with this cut, that actually answers your question. But people are not going to get there. And as an operator, your job is to make people feel safe. That at a very core level is your job.
Yeah.
And so providing the best answer, or providing the most data, if people don't know how to use it or are not ingesting it in an efficient way, they're not really getting the value, and thus they're not going to feel safe.
Yeah. Question.
Can you repeat that concept one more time? I think it's so critical and something
Yeah.
I forget often as a sales leader.
Yeah.
Do you mind repeating that concept one more time?
Yeah, I'll try to repeat it, and then Greg correct me.
Yeah.
So your report should do one of two things. One is it should tell you that something is wrong, and then the other one is it should tell you why it's wrong.
Right.
It should never try to mix those things. You shouldn't have a report that says, I'm short on opportunities, and here's why. Right? You should separate those things. That's a killer
Correct.
concept I hadn't heard before.
So the way that it gets implemented is, in a perfect world, you would have one dashboard where your result from looking at it is just a yes or no. Like, yes, something's wrong, no, something's not wrong. And when you look at the dashboard, you're like, okay, there are 3 things here that look wrong. I'm gonna go somewhere else to investigate those 3 things. And separating the two is very, very helpful.
I actually heard, one time I met a guy who's like a fighter pilot, F-18s, and I was talking about like how complex it's got to be sitting in front of like all these gauges and like making decisions about what you do. And he goes, honestly, you sit there and you kind of like soften your focus and you just look at everything at once. And if any needle seems to be off, then you focus on that, right? Because there's just too many things to keep track of. If you try to add layers of complexity, if they had this gauge is off and here's why and this is what you need to do, it'd just be too much to ingest. So ideally, if you're trying to make people feel safe, like Greg had mentioned, you got to give them information that's very easy to digest. You can't make it complex. You got to keep it as simple as possible. So oftentimes it's removing information you're giving to people, right? Identifying signal rather than noise and giving people just pure signal if you can. And I think that's a killer way of thinking about it.
Do you have any other questions before we move on?
Cool. Oh, yeah, what do you want to say?
So kind of just continuing, so where we're at now is we are at the point where we're assessing kind of what people want to happen versus what do the system support and looking for that delta. So let's assume you've done that. You're like, hey, like, let's take lead to opportunity process, for example. You're like, hey, talk to the VP of sales. This is what he wants to happen. This is what she wants to happen. Here's what's actually happening. There's a big gap. So now you know this is something that needs to be addressed. Not on fire yet, probably because you haven't missed your quarter, but eventually it's going to come around. So what we will then do is, once we've decided this is something we need to address, we'll then say, what does the future state look like? And the reason we focus on future state is because sometimes it takes a while to implement. By the time you've like scoped, implemented, got buy-in, trained, everything, like it could be as little as 2 weeks, it could be as much as like 3 months. In which case, we do not want to build stuff, and you all don't want to build things that become obsolete right when you kind of release it. So we'll generally go 6 to 9 months out and try to figure out what does the future state look like. Are you going to be, how much is the team growing by? Are you starting new teams? Maybe like, oh, great, you're launching an enterprise team. We should probably account for that. Marketing is going to be ramping up on events. We should probably account for that. And so once we have the future state, we'll then kind of implement that into our solution. So we'll say, hey, we're going to fix the lead to opportunity process. Here are all the goals that you've all said. This will also help for the future. And then I think the last thing that we generally do, which is super important, is segment out the different kind of aspects of your project. And when I say that, what I mean is, in a lead to opportunity process, for example, what we'll say is, here's the solution for the sales team as you have now. Here is the add-on solution to support enterprise sales. Here's the add-on solution to support the marketing piece as well. Here is just the SDR piece. And the reason we do that is because, A, we want to be very transparent. And whether you're a consultant or not, like, you really want to be transparent around what problem you're solving. Because what you don't want is you solve it for sales, and then at the end, marketing is saying, why are you guys celebrating? Like, we still don't have visibility into all of our inquiries. You want to be able to say, hey, like, we presented this, we agreed to not focus on that until next quarter. The more you can set people's expectations around what problems you're solving and what problems you're not solving, the better off you'll be. Like, most of your success as an operator is going to come from people feeling confident in you. Going back to what I said about making people feel safe. And a huge way to do that is to be very explicit about what problems you're not solving.
So I'm going to ask questions because Greg knows way more than I do, so I'm just going to ask him questions like I was you guys.
Very false, but I appreciate it.
So one challenge that I had when I was doing operations is like communication, right? So what I'm communicating about, hey, marketing team, we've delivered that project you wanted. Sales, we're working on yours. Success, we're working on whatever. The finance team would sit there and be like, I don't care about any of this. This doesn't apply to me. So how do you communicate across silos so that, one, more than sales hears that you're doing things, but also you're making this stuff valuable for all the other people? Because like, as you're building stuff, you got to communicate it to everybody in all the different teams and stakeholders, right? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is there is almost always a piece that is applicable for everyone. If you're changing how leads kind of come in and how leads get converted, there is a way to make that interesting for your HR team. Right? There's a way to make that interesting for recruiting. It's like, hey, tell sales candidates that this is figured out. They're going to get a lot more leads. And so I think it's more about figuring out how could this potentially affect them, right? Just have the idea. What I think about a lot is if this person came back to me in 3 months and was pissed I didn't tell them that this was happening, what are they going to say? Why would they be angry? And try to get ahead of that. And if you can just kind of think through what the future might look like and why things will go poorly, that is a great way to start to set better expectations.
So once you've, figured out the delta, you've built towards it, you've communicated it to everybody, at what point do you look back at stuff and decide, I'm going to rip this back out, it doesn't apply anymore? What's the cadence to do those types of things? Because with content, it's easy, right? Every 9 months, we're going to evaluate our content, see if it fits. But with operations, it feels like we're always adding, but it's rare to remove things, right?
Yeah, so I mean, in a perfect world, if you have the bandwidth, and you can kind of do this, it doesn't take a ton of time once you get used to doing this. Ideally, you should do this once a quarter. You should pick kind of like, there's probably like 5 to 7 main aspects of your sales process, right? There's kind of lead to opportunity, opportunity to demo, demo to close, you have your quoting process, you have your marketing inbound process. So if you can just kind of separate out the 5 to 7 aspects of your sales process, and every quarter just evaluate what do we want to be happening and what is currently happening, and just attack the thing that has the greatest delta, that is probably the best way to do it.
Question?
Yep.
Yeah, to follow up on communication, if you roll out like a new process, how are you guys typically, training people? Is it live sessions? You're creating videos that you probably have to redo next quarter?
Yeah. So from the consulting side, it's really nice because we don't own any of the individual contributors. So a lot of times it's like we'll coach the person responsible for Salesforce and allow them to do it. That doesn't apply to like being a normal operator, so that can't help you guys. The way that I typically, when I was doing operations stuff, we would release something and I would typically train the managers that this would directly impact. So if we're doing quote to cash as an example, I spent a lot of time individually working with the sales leaders to make sure that they completely understood it. And then I tended to do just a live demo with the reps where they could ask questions like this, and then I would record videos walking through everything and have that stored in a place they could access. So it made it easy in case they had a question or they couldn't attend it, they could always review back. And a lot of times I'd be kind of a dick and say, like, watch the video, I sent it over, right? Because it gets hard sometimes. What's up?
Let's say I'm a first-time sales ops guy.
Okay.
And
Hard.
I'm promoted from within.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
What would you recommend my 30, 60, 90 day look like?
Right away, I'd focus in the first 30 days, learn to code. Most important thing that it has completely, a lot of eyes perked up all of a sudden, completely changed my career trajectory. I didn't know how to code when I first took over Salesforce for a 350-person company, but within 6 months, I'd released a separate product, company, its own product. So like in 6 months, you can learn to code in a way that you can create your own business. But it's allowed me to have really solid conversations because one of the things that people tend to be good with operations is I can either talk to executives or I'm very technical, but you're rarely both. Right? Like I can describe a process and figure out how to fix it, but I don't know how to pull levers. So if you can understand how to code, it's going to open up the breadth of problems you can solve because you can talk to developers to get into, like a challenge that we get all the time is we want to integrate our backend system with Salesforce. Happens all the time. We don't have Zapier or something like that. We need to directly integrate it. If you're an operator and you're the person responsible for that project and you have no concept about how data flows between databases, you're stuck. Right? So having that skill set, I found is really critical. I know Greg knows how to code. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's akin to being a product manager and not being able to code.
Yeah.
Like you really just have no way to A, call bullshit, B, have higher technical conversations.
And you don't know how complex things are. Is an integration 10 minutes or 100 hours? Like you don't know.
Yeah.
But once you've actually gone through those things, I'll get you. It's a huge asset. I know we've only got like, what, 5-ish minutes or so? We're done?
We can do one more question.
One more question. You're up.
So in the account-based strategy,
Yeah.
do you see marketing and sales ops as one, and where does it lie within the org chart?
You want to chime in, or I'm happy to?
Yeah, so I think they should be on the same team because they're using very similar systems. They're both going to use Salesforce, and sales ops should know how to use Marketo or Pardot or whatever you're using. In terms of where it should live, there really is no right answer. I know a lot of companies will say, we have it under finance or we have it under sales, and like that is the best way to do it. And like that's great that it works for them, but really what ends up happening is those operations teams will just flow to whoever is the most operational. So it usually doesn't really work as well, generally speaking, under marketing because marketing leaders tend to be less operational and more on the creative and branding side. It can work well under sales if the sales leader is kind of an operationally minded leader. If they're more of like a super rep, then probably it's not going to work out as well. So I would not think of it as a right or wrong answer. It should be whoever is the most operationally minded.
Yeah, and my perspective is pretty aligned. I mean, my thought is that operations should be making decisions that impact the whole company, and they should be taking everything into consideration. If you're a sales operations person, you don't give a shit about marketing. Like I'm focused on sales operations, and vice versa, right? Marketers aren't thinking about the downstream impacts of all these things. But if you're a marketer, you need to be, or sorry, operator, you should be looking at things independently of the pressure you may be getting from your individual boss. You should be able to look at these things objectively. So in my mind, I would prefer operations to be completely independent, its own silo within these teams, and have ownership over what's going to happen. Yeah, that's it. We're through.
Thank you so much. This was, wow.